not that necessarily happening.
Hi everyone, we're going to get started. Welcome to tonight's event. We're hosting the Open Economics Forum. We are a student society at SOAS dedicated to promoting pluralism in economics and linking economics and politics with each other more than they are in academia at the moment. We're part of the Rethinking Economics network, which is a global network of students campaigning for exactly the same thing, essentially. We're organising our annual conference at the end of June. I encourage you all to come if you can. Find us on Facebook. We have a website, Rethinking Economics. I'll stop talking about that now and start talking about this. Tonight we're going to talk about Syriza. Are Syriza's political objectives economically viable? We're joined today by Paul Mason, economics editor at Channel 4, and Vicky Pryce, chief advisor at the Centre for Economics and Business Research and author of Greekonomics, which incidentally is on sale outside. If at the end of the talk you've enjoyed what she's had to say, then maybe have a look and see if you'd like to buy the book for £10. That's all from me. We're going to have about half an hour to 40 minutes of sort of an open interview conducted by Peter, and then we'll open it up for half an hour of questions. I hope you enjoy. Thank you very much.
So, again, thank you all for being here. I won't do too much talking tonight either, because we've got two excellent speakers here who are ready to do that for me. So instead, I'll just walk you all briefly through some of the key events that have been happening throughout the past 6 years since the outset of the economic crisis. So in 2009, following the outbreak of the financial and economic crisis in 2008, we saw the first austerity measures being imposed in Greece by the PASOK government at that time. In 2011, after a number of other similar packages and bailouts and austerity measures, PASOK stepped back following the announcement of new measures, and a technocratic interim government took its place. And in 2012, at the June elections, Syriza saw its share of the vote rise from 4.6 in 2009 to 27. It didn't, however, lead to a Syriza-led government. The New Democracy Party, the Conservatives, instead took over and led a PASOK and New Democracy and government flanked by another left party. Excuse me. In 2014, after a range of new austerity measures and bailout packages, Syriza won first the EU elections with 26%. And in December, Parliament failed to appoint a new president, which prompted new parliamentary elections. And then in January 2015, Syriza won the election by 36% and formed a new government with the independent Greeks. So that was the long story, but it didn't quite stop there, because in February, Syriza had to try to implement all of these promises, live up to what they promised the Greek people through the negotiations with the Eurogroup, the Eurozone governments. And that led to Syriza accepting the extension of the existing bailout agreement in turn for giving up key anti-austerity goals and undertaking a new EU reform program. So the facts are that for 6 years, Greece has seen its output fall by about 25%, and now we have a youth unemployment rate in the country of about 50% and a debt to GDP ratio of about 175%. However, we have seen throughout 2015 economic growth in Greece, and unemployment has been falling as well. So, question is Syriza gonna turn this fortunate development into something more negative? In your book, why it's kicking off everywhere from 2011, excuse me. You stated that the problem is if you impose austerity on a country already in the grip of recession and which cannot devalue its currency, that recession merely gets worse. Is that what you expect to be happening in Greece as well at this moment? Because we have seen positive development following the austerity measure.
No, we haven't. No, we haven't. So let's clear up a few facts. The 25% fall in GDP occurred over 4 years, and it occurred after the IMF predicted that maximum amount of fall in GDP due to austerity would have been 4%, and that there would have been a growth recovery within 18 months of it starting. So that's the first thing about what happened, that the IMF imposed, and as did the Troika, an austerity package, which didn't work. That's the first thing we have to get our heads around. At the end of that, at the very end, in the last 3 quarters, what you had in Greece was a small recovery in growth and a flattening off of the unemployment problem, i.e. unemployment stopped growing. When you break it down, because the state started spending money. That's simply what happened. So the Greek state ran out of austerity measures to do, stopped doing the extra austerity that it was supposed to do, and spent money. Most of the recovery, so-called recovery, is that, and that's gone. And incidentally, it's gone already. It's not going because Syriza took power. Obviously, a lot of damage is now being done to the Greek economy by the fact that there is massive uncertainty and a massive liquidity crunch and massive capital flight. And we can come to that. But what we measure, as you know as economists, is we measure what's just happened. And what's just happened is that the recovery, it cannot be claimed to have been the result of austerity, and certainly not 4 years after the most bitter and destructive austerity. So, what I would throw at you as the answer to the question in this posed here in the debate is it's slightly the wrong question. The real question is whether or not Syriza's economic aims are politically viable. That's the best way of understanding it. And their economic aims were to stop the austerity that was destroying the Greek economy, to take the economy out of the hands of effectively an unchallengeable coalition of corrupt oligarchic parties, full of people who are going to be in jail within the next 18 months. And whether or not they were going to do both of those things in a way that recognised the key problem in Greece, and that is that 177% of GDP, debt to GDP ratio, is not sustainable. So you have to do something about it. No level of austerity, i.e. I presume here at SOAS in the economics department, we understand what a budget surplus is. No level of budget surplus that can pay down a 177% of GDP debt is sustainable by the economy. It's always going to tank the economy unless you can do one thing. You can internally devalue, and this was done in some of the Baltic states, in a way that allows you to produce your way out. So workers take pay cuts of 25%, and then somebody invests, and a factory appears, a sweatshop, or a Starbucks, and people get jobs, and then after a while some growth happens. That's one way. The other way is you externally devalue, so you devalue your currency. Greece can't externally devalue because it's part of the euro, and when it internally devalued, this is the problem. See, Greece is part of these multilateral organisations like the IMF, the European Union, the Eurozone. They are equally culpable as the coalition governments in Greece were. This is Greece. This is a real economy. It's not an abstract economy in an economics textbook. It's an economy which doesn't respond to internal devaluation. That is, there is no Starbucks, there is no factory, they do produce things, tomatoes and grapes and tourism, but a lot of these things are not responsive to internal devaluation. You can cut the wages of the person who comes and cleans my villa on Kefalonia by half again, but the economy's not going to recover. So that's my way of posing the question.
So, regarding finding a solution, Vicky, you've been quite staunch that austerity isn't the way out of the crisis either. Do you think that Syriza then will manage to find its way around these pitfalls and actually manage to bring economic and social well-being around?
Well, with difficulty. I mean, the interesting thing is that you're having a debate with two people who probably agree rather violently with each other. And of course, if you've done any economics, you would agree violently about this, because I mean, after all, Nobel Prize winners are all saying that the austerity package that the IMF imposed on Greece was completely and utterly wrong. And of course, just like Paul was saying, it has had very few results in terms of increasing Greece's competitiveness. The truth is, of course, that in addition to the government itself easing off a little bit in order to get re-elected, people in the last year stopped paying the taxes. They were terribly uncertain about what else was going to come and hit them. And of course, in the expectation that there might be some amnesty, they didn't even pay the interest on their loans. So the banking crisis became worse in the process. So it is rather difficult to get out of this unless there is some agreement with the Europeans. What is the most extraordinary thing is in a way, Peter was right about the economy beginning to improve, because in addition to the government, we also had very substantial tourism receipts, mainly because of all the problems in the Middle East and North Africa. People were rather worried about going anywhere else, and loads came to Greece. I have, though, met quite a few who said, we're going to go to Greece to help the economy, which sounds rather sweet. And they have done, which is in contrast to what the Germans used to say, which is, oh, the Greeks are such profligate people, we're going to punish them by not going to Greece this summer, and not realizing that that would make it even more unlikely that they would ever pay the money back that they owed to the Germans. So at least lots of the Germans have finally, I think, realized, or at least they've missed the heat and have turned up back again in Greece last summer in record numbers. So Greece has done rather well out of that. So it is true, as Peter was saying, that the economy was beginning to recover. The most extraordinary thing is that Greece hasn't suddenly found itself in this terrible economic situation. I mean, it's been going on for some time, but it was beginning to show some signs, which is probably where I disagree slightly with Paul, of at least nearing the end of the sort of bailout requirements, which is what the previous government was trying to achieve back in the autumn. Because Greece had achieved one of the fastest turnarounds in its deficit situation. The deficit, which was 15% of GDP back in 2009, was reduced to less than 2% in 2014. And there was a primary surplus. In other words, if you exclude the interest that they had to pay on their debt, the Greeks were collecting more than they were spending. The government was collecting more than it was spending, so it had a primary surplus. It wasn't huge, and there were still problems because debt servicing accounts for about 4% of GDP in Greece. And the primary surplus was about 1.5% of GDP. But at least it was showing some serious signs of being able to manage its finances. Admittedly, some of it was by not paying contractors. So businesses were going bankrupt, they weren't spending enough money on medicines. It's quite extraordinary, really, to see that infant mortality has gone up in Greece. So there was a health system that was collapsing, and that Greece couldn't afford it anyway. The thing that also helped the Greek government is that there is really no such thing as a welfare system in Greece. So once you're unemployed for a bit, you lose everything. No unemployment benefit, no access to the insurance that you had for your health. It's really, really quite extraordinary. But it allows the government to just not spend very much if it doesn't want to, and collect more money, because the IMF had been increasing property taxes and everything else that you could possibly think of, which the Greeks found difficult to pay, but they had been paying some of it. And VAT had gone up and so on. And the interesting thing is that because the Greek situation had improved so significantly in terms of its finances, yes, there was still a big debt. The Greeks were able to go back to markets and borrow money in the capital markets. They hadn't done that for years, paying less than 5% interest rate. At the time, I thought, what on earth is the point of this, since the rest of the loans is below 2.5%? There's no much point. But they had to demonstrate to the markets that they were there. So Greece was in a situation where it was reaching the point where it could very seriously go to the Europeans and say, we reached the end of our bailout a little bit early, just like Ireland and Portugal has done. We have reduced our deficit to GDP ratio. Yes, we have a problem with our debt, which we have to sort out at some point. Everyone knows that these debts are going to have to be restructured across Europe. So it's not a secret that Greece needs to restructure its debt. And this is the budget for 2015 we've just put together, which is a tough budget. We'll have a slightly higher lower deficit and a slightly higher primary surplus, and will grow by 2.9%, which was the estimated forecast. And that was passed in Parliament. Pretty tough, even more austerity measures. I'm Greek. I was in Greece in the summer when the latest demand for property taxes arrived through the doors of everyone, and people were pulling their hair out. But that was the way in which they were going to be collecting some more taxes. And it was pretty tough for many people, including more reductions in government spending. And it was passed through Parliament. So Samaras, the previous Prime Minister of New Democracy, goes to the Europeans in the autumn, says, this is our budget, and I think we can deliver it. There was a bit of concern, of course, about whether he could deliver it. He was weakening a lot because he didn't have a big majority. He had a big majority, about 4 or 5 he could master with his coalition. And the Europeans said, no, we want an extra less than 2 billion, an extra 2 billion, let's say, rounded up, of cuts, which no way could you put through Parliament. Now, 2 billion of cuts, which of course they could get through, they came back, had a snap election for the president, that was basically a vote of no confidence, and then the elections, which of course have brought Greece very close to chaos, and everyone is worried about Brexit and what the euro would do. Now, if you were a European head of state or finance minister, why exactly would you do that? I mean, remember, the European Central Bank is now spending, in order to safeguard all the other countries from contagion, 60 billion a month on quantitative easing. So what's 2 billion a year, which the Greeks had to find? Now, why can't you pat people on the back who have seen a 25% reduction in GDP, who've reduced the deficit to GDP ratio so significantly, and have introduced a number of reforms, in fact, more reforms than the majority of the countries in the EU have actually put through? Which is the one country which reformed least? Germany. Which are the countries that have done nothing and have just got an extension in terms of when they have to achieve the 3% deficit to GDP ratio? France and Italy. Now, why is there a different rule for the big countries and a different rule for the small countries? And for that little difference, in the budget for 2015, we should have dispersed the remaining of the bailout, allowed the next tranche, which was supposed to be agreed, of 15 billion, to keep them going for the following year, just in case there was a problem. We now have a banking crisis in Greece, and we have, of course, the economy collapsing again, rather than improving. Nothing's happened in the economy since then. And I think the Europeans have an awful lot to answer for. How easy is it for Syriza, given that it's actually been voted on an anti-austerity platform, to get things through? Impossible, unless the Europeans compromise.
So it's quite interesting. You bring up these other countries. Well, you bring up Germany, you bring up France, and so on. But you also see a lot of other countries in the EU that face a very high debt to GDP ratio as well. How does that play into the negotiations that are going on at the moment? For instance, we've got a meeting coming up in the Eurogroup in just 4 days. 3 days now, on the 24th of April. One of the issues to be solved, perhaps not at this meeting, as you told me before, is the question of liquidity, because Greece is running out of liquidity quite quickly. What do you expect to be the outcome for?
Well, before I answer that, can I just rewind a bit, because I think it's worth exploring what the differences are between me and you, Vicky, on this. I don't see a V-shaped graph that ends in a little sort of lambda symbol that sort of flattens out as the beginning, as a sort of big end of pain. Because I think if you look at the whole situation, and you know it well, and those other people in the room who know Greece well could understand this, the 4 years of austerity had a cumulative effect on the political economy of Greece. If I just give an example. So, what did it produce? It produced a conservative-led coalition whose advisors were in sporadic but provable contact with an outright violent fascist party, whose police were completely infiltrated by that fascist party, beating up people at will, taking pictures of demonstrators on their mobile phones and sharing them with fascist cadres. All of this, arbitrary police action against demonstrators, arbitrary police action against migrants, to the level where Greece is probably in breach of Geneva Conventions. So the graph doesn't tell you the whole story. And when, as we all know, even when it sort of levels out, the whole story doesn't suddenly get better. If I give you an example, the documentary I'm making, which is all about, is trying to look at the micro story here. We went to one village in Corinthos that had gone more or less completely in the space of 10 years from being a conservative, rural conservative village to 28-29% Syriza and 7% fascist. So it's a completely radicalised village now, and it's full of people who believe in God, go to church, all of this. What was the thing that happened to them? It was that in addition to all the arbitrary taxes, because some of the taxes were regular, some of the taxes were simply, we need money, you need to give us some tax. It's linked to your electricity bill. If you don't pay it, you're switched off. Lots of people in that village have no electricity. Then it comes to the farmers. Of course, they all bank with a specific bank. But the bank that they bank with is one of the ones that was then negatively involved in the Cypriot bailout and ended up basically getting into terrible trouble over that. And therefore, is trying to foreclose on 60% of the land in the area. So 60% of the farmers are facing existence level crisis. Lots of suicides happen all the time in and around this village. And then what happens is that apparently regularly, but increasingly, with increasing frequency, the wholesalers and the middlemen who come to the village and buy the grapes, make off with the grapes, leave an IOU, and then go bankrupt. And this is regular. And of course, when you try and do the rule of law in Greece, you then face this problem that these two parties, this oligarchic system that the EU has been all too keen to do deals with, sits there and goes, that's my brother, that's my uncle, the judge is my friend. This is a mafia-run state at local level. And these farmers just went, who can help us? Nobody else. Golden Dawn or Syriza. Well, we're good Christian people. Let's have the ones who don't want to kill Jews and kill migrants. That's how it's happened. Now, so to answer your question, what is the likely outcome? Syriza, Varoufakis did a massive U-turn on the 20th of Feb in Brussels. I was there. I saw him do it. We can see why, because the ECB unleashed a purposive assault on the Greek banking system. This will go down in history as when a regulator tries to bankrupt the banks of a state it's supposed to be regulating. It was clear that they connived in, they made it happen, and the day Varoufakis turned up, he had to surrender. But he didn't surrender everything. Everything that's gone on between February the 20th and probably April 24th is the next milestone, has been that the attempt by the European Commission, the majority I would say in the Eurogroup, I don't know whether you agree with it, the majority in the Eurogroup, plus Obama, plus the Brits, to get and the Council of Europe, that is the heads of government, to get a politically brokered settlement that says, look, a form of the backdown that Varoufakis did on the 20th of Feb is the deal to get Greece contingently through the next few months, whereby we can then negotiate on the actual debt. Because we're not talking about the debt here, we're just talking about just the fiscal viability of the state from day to day.
Yeah, and to clarify what you meant by an attack by the ECB, you meant...
Well, they pulled the waiver, they pulled the normal access to credit swaps, so that leaving Greece reliant on emergency lending assistance. That's where we've been, and throughout it all, I think this is the key point. The Greeks thought they were dealing with the old Europe, where sort of a westernising, German, centrist government would eventually listen to Matteo Renzi, to Hollande, to Obama ringing them up. And in the end, sad to say, what has happened is that Germany is no longer ruled by politicians who listen to the westernising, intellectual, elite, Europhile part of Germany. They listen to tiny towns in Bavaria and Brandenburg who if if you turn up with a 50 euro note, will scribble it with a little pen to see if you're a foreigner, whether or not you're cheating them. See, I've covered and studied Germany for a long time, and not until this year have I seen German politics being run from the tiny towns of Bavaria and Brandenburg, and not by the German intellectual elite. And that was the mistake the Greeks made. They thought they were dealing with the old Merkel. They're dealing with a bunch of people who now are really making policy to satisfy populist right-wing thinking in their own country. Finland as well, the Baltic states as well.
It hasn't done Finland any good, of course.
No, of course it's not done any of them any
None
good,
at all,
and it won't do Germany any good ultimately, because when the great day comes, or the horrible day, I should say, I wouldn't be flippant about this, the horrible day might come that Vladimir Putin presses the button on some more instability in Eastern Europe. You can forget trans-European solidarity with all those countries who wanted to kill Greece. And I'm afraid this is the thinking in a lot of Western European capitals as well, not just Athens.
Care to comment?
I agree with absolutely everything Paula says, unfortunately, which is rather sad. Of course, the interesting thing is that the entire political leadership of Golden Dawn has just gone on trial.
Yeah.
The entire political leadership, and of course they are a sort of criminal party, supposedly, and of course inciting murder. So at least something is happening. Which is quite extraordinary that it should be the case. So there are some things, and indeed a number of the people who had been terribly corrupt in the past, and I absolutely agree with what was going on before. But this has included some of their ministers have been now found to have taken bribes, and the defence minister, for example, is in jail, or at least unless he's come out since. The previous defence minister. But I think what is more, which is really rather interesting, is that the biggest cases of corruption in Greece have involved German firms bribing Greece. So this whole idea that the Germans do things a different way and the Greeks need to learn from the Germans and be more like them is quite interesting, since they seem to have been the ones most involved. And what is even more worrying when you look at what's happened with Europe, this is why I personally would still put only 50-50 for the Eurozone to survive as is, because it's alienating quite considerably. But the interesting thing is that the reason why Greece has this huge debt, which has been sort of forced on it to a considerable extent, was because the Germans, the French and others wanted to save their own banking system. And because Greece was going through a crisis and its banking system was looking a bit frayed, to put it mildly, what they really wanted to do was make sure that the German banks and the French banks who would lend to the Greeks, as they had lent to the Spaniards, would be saved. So what's happened is that basically there was a lot of support given to the Greek banking system so that the other banks could exit and compensated for as well. And the burden for the losses that all these banks would make was transferred to the Greek people in the form of a huge debt. That's basically what's happened, to put it in a sort of very simple way. And if you look at the second bailout that Greece got in 2012, it had one in 2010, one in 2012. The vast majority of it, which was over 100 billion, went to the banks again, compensation for haircuts for those who took haircuts. In other words, those who didn't get, who had to swap the debt that they're holding of the Greek state into things that had lower face value. So they went to compensate those. A number of them were financial institutions, of course. And only about 10, at most 15%, went to the Greek government itself to continue to function. It's actually quite criminal when you look at what's happened. And there are a number of people now who are starting this process of looking at what they call odious debt. In other words, this is debt which should never have been imposed on the individual Greeks. And then there is another element of it which is interesting, because the Greeks say, the Germans and others say, the Greeks are sort of corrupt, lazy, retire early, etc., etc. I mean, so some of that is true, as we just heard. But you could take out Greece and strike the name and put Italy, and a large part of Italy would be very, very similar. You could do the same and do Spain, and you see what the scandals have been there in the banking system and elsewhere, which is absolutely extraordinary, plus the big black market that Spain has. So Greece is not an outlier, but it just was so unlucky in terms of the way it negotiated some of these things. Very bad advice, whoever it is who gave it to the Greeks at the time. And of course this has left the Greeks with the debt which they simply cannot, under any circumstances, repay. But it's no different, because you touched on that, Peter, as well, when you asked the question. If you look at what happened in Ireland, for example, and also in Portugal, it's a similar thing about the banking system. The Eurozone is meant to, should have had the ECB as a lender of last resort, should have had transfers of money from the rich to the poor. None of this happened at all. They had to build some of these things afterwards, when the crisis hit, slowly, but very badly as well, really. It's just not quite getting there yet. So there wasn't this type of support. But if you look at Ireland, of course, what happened in the Eurozone is that all the credit rating agencies assumed that the risk of the debt in Greece was just as high as or as low as the risk of German debt, because they assumed that somebody would step in and help if there was a problem. And after all, we're all part of the same thing. And they were prepared to lend very, very cheaply. But what it did, it encouraged the banks in individual countries to think they were European banks, because there was no risk. People would move their money around. In fact, €1 issued in Ireland should be just, it's a legal tender in Germany. And even though, the states are quite different, it was assumed that it's all the same, and it encouraged banks who thought there was no risk in transactions across countries to become those almost global banks, to such an extent that when the crisis hit, we found one bank in Ireland which had a balance sheet which was larger than the country itself, the country's GDP itself. And when that happened, it wasn't as if all the other European countries came and said, oh, well, let's help you a bit. No. The problem of solving the crisis fell back onto the national governments. So the deficit to GDP ratio of Ireland in 2009, I think it must have been, when it tried to rescue its banking system, was 35%. Which is the deficit. And Ireland has ended up now with a debt to GDP ratio of 130%. Now, Portugal is the same. So how can this country survive in the future without any restructuring themselves? Are they any different to Greece? The answer is no.
Interesting. So maybe you want to comment briefly, and after that we'll take some questions from the floor.
On what?
On whatever the floor wants to ask.
No, but let's come to what's likely to happen. I think this is what I think is likely to happen at the moment. Huge geopolitical pressure has come onto Germany over its repeated attempts to get the ECB to kill Greece. That's what's happening. Obama, you look at Obama. Reina Duru met Obama. Wasn't just Varoufakis. Reina Duru is probably most senior Syriza female politician. She's the mayor of Attica, prefect of Attica. So the Obama and Jack Lew are really on the case, and they're rattling the cage over, look, there's a lot of other things. Migrants, you want to stop the migrants flooding into the Schengen area, start with Greece. You want to stop Greece doing a deal with Vladimir Putin, start with Greece. So that's the pressure. Right now, the talks are, as I understand it, like this. There's agreement in Brussels that Greece will be allowed to run a 1.2 to 1.5% of GDP primary surplus, and they can do it because they've done a sensible set of sort of, look, pay your taxes and you get a 30% discount type thing. It's bringing money in. So the fiscal target, as I understand it, is agreed. The Greeks just do not agree with the Eurozone and the IMF on how much tax-raising measures will raise, but that's, I think, that's not going to, you're not going to destroy the Eurozone over that, because the British government will disagree with the OBR and the IFS over exactly these kind of issues. How much will a microeconomic tax raising measure raise? So on that, I think what I've been told is that that issue is kind of parked. There's agreement to disagree. And then there's three areas: privatisation, labour market reform. What's the other one I've blogged about?
Pensions.
Pensions. And privatisation is agreed, as far as I understand it, because they've agreed that PPP is the way forward, rather than just selling it to your brother or to a Chinese friend of your uncle. It's better to actually get the state. So if you're going to sell your entire airports or the most important strategic railway in Europe, better to do it in a slightly more long-term way, which leaves the state on a stake. This is what, as I understand. So it leaves labour market reform and pensions. And I think that's where we are. If we get to Thursday, Friday, and there is positive mood music over labour market reform and pensions, then what will happen, or what the Greeks expect to happen, is that the Europeans just say, look, it's all going well. We can't raise the ELA ceiling anymore at the ECB, but we could raise the amount of treasury bills that the Greek banks are allowed to do. What can stop that? What you see, those of you on Twitter will have seen what can stop it. Repeated frantic briefings by the European Central Bank that Greece is about to go bust. That's what's happening at the moment. Bloomberg, CNBC, follow it on Twitter. Whenever you see the European Central Bank officials quoted that Greece is on the verge of bankruptcy and it's all going to go wrong, that means that the talks are going well in the Commission and the Council. That's the world you live in.
But remember that in whenever it was 2012, lots of banks were betting that the likelihood of Greece leaving was, or defaulting and leaving the euro, in other words, Grexit, was 90%.
Yeah.
Citibank, I think, hit 9%. Then it sort of slowly lowered it and then sort of hid it somewhere.
What percent do you think it is?
Well, I think it's 50%. I think I would go to that, although I am. The problem is that we think that people are logical, and indeed that they would do what is good for Europe. But of course, what they do, the only thing they worry about is what is good for their own little whatever constituency thing back home, which is very bad. But what we've also seen, nevertheless, with Germany is that you have, Schäuble saying, who's the finance minister, saying very negative things, and then you have finally sort of Merkel agreeing to all sorts of things that have happened in Europe, in the eurozone, including quantitative easing, which would never have been, where the Constitutional Court tried a few times to block it, and in the end agreed, and so it's going ahead. So there are these sort of issues there, but you would imagine that there would be, this geopolitical thing would be really worrying, because again we don't know if it's true, but the word on the street is that both, probably Paul knows more, that both Syriza and the very right-wing party that they've teamed up with, independent Greeks for the moment, are financed by the Russians. Now, we don't know the extent of it, but that's what everybody says. And obviously, if that is the case, or even if there is any possibility of Russian money coming in, somebody needs to worry about it a little bit more, especially given what's going on right now. So you just don't know exactly what game is being played. The Greeks think that the Europeans have, certainly all the people I speak to, and I speak quite often, that they have a plan which is beginning already to surface in the things you hear from the Germans, which is that you could say until now that the problems were all because of lack of reform from the previous government and lack of belief in all this clientelist stuff and corruption. So you could blame the previous government for everything. And now, of course, because Syriza is so difficult and the economy, because of everything that's happening, is collapsing because of them, they can, by June, say, oh, it's all Syriza's fault. So they can extract they can sort of remove themselves from any blame for this, and satisfy also their voters back home. The end game of that, of course, would be complete collapse. Possibly a referendum in Greece, possibly another election. Although my optimism, if there is another election, is that Syriza will jettison the very radical left of its party and become, effectively, the old PASOK, which was the centre-left party. Varoufakis himself, as we know, was advisor to George Papandreou, who was the PASO leader. So loads and loads of uncertainty. But if I were logical, I mean, economists are blamed for getting things wrong. And I have to always say that we do assume, unfortunately, still the rational expectations hypothesis. We assume that people are going to be logical in what they do. And certainly when it comes to politics, that's a very, very wrong assumption to make.
All right. So let's hope there's any rational questions out there. All right, I see a lot of hands already. We're going to take 3 at a time, and then we'll have those questions answered, and then we'll move on. So, you go first.
Me?
Mm-hmm.
Hi. My name is Liana Magrin. I'm a politics student. Thank you all for being here. I'm also Greek, and I have 2 questions. So first of all, I will be the last person to ever argue that Greece didn't have major structural, arbitrary, bureaucratic issues before the crisis. However, I have been wondering ever since 2009 not only why the IMF imposed such an austerity package that was clearly not viable, but why did the Papandreou government sign it and agree to that without even negotiating it, like, to the extent that I think, you know, would be acceptable. Which is why I think that even if Syriza turns into a neo-PASOK government, I don't think that this is going to be the best thing that the country can have right now. But still better than having in-party fights that they keep having right now with the whole Kukwe
Communist Party.
yeah, faction in their party. And secondly, after what happened yesterday with the fact that Syriza asked from the public agencies to give them the reserved cash to the Greek Central Bank, do you think that this is the road straight to default?
So that was 2 questions. We're going to take one more.
Yeah, so maybe it relates a little bit to the first question, but I was wondering, so in 2013, Olivier Blanchard came out and said that actually the multiplier effect was wrong, like in terms of austerity measures. And so the IMF came out and said that austerity packages actually don't work in our, especially in Greece, like instead of having a multiplier effect of less than 1, it's probably 2.5 or even higher. How come like this, theoretically in terms of economics, like the theory of austerity was disproved, it still like wasn't like challenged politically. So just like if you have a certain input on that.
Do you want to start?
Well, yes. In terms of why did they accept it? Big mistake. As I said, hinted. I don't know who's. I think I do know who advisor, but nevertheless, it should never have happened. What is more, there was for a while. I mean, he did resign around the 2012 thing. Finally, finally. But what happened afterwards was even worse, and that's the real problem. Because he, at least he had some concerns about accepting some of the whatever second bailout thing might have meant. Because the second bailout may never have happened if Merkel and Sarkozy hadn't suddenly announced that any of the defaults that may happen in any country they wouldn't intervene at all. They would let whoever was holding any debt to actually suffer that. If you remember, there was this famous meeting was it Toulouse or somewhere?
You mean
Whatever, somewhere in France. Somewhere nice.
The French. It's on Deauville.
Deauville. And that of course panicked the markets completely, and then rates went up, crazily, which meant that Greece was once again unable to go out to capital markets. And then of course, if you do that, you're stuck because you can't fund your deficit. I mean, that's the real problem. And of course, there was still a deficit there, still quite high, which had to be funded. So partly they caused that. And then of course he resigned, and we had this technocratic government. Everyone was saying it's very good to have a technocratic government because it's not actually touched by politics and all that sort of stuff. And of course, the technocratic guy was, I think, an economist who was used to run the Bank of Greece, and he was number 2 at the ECB. Now what did he do? He did exactly what I explained before, which is the banks were the only thing that he worried about. European banks were the only thing he worried about. and got Greece stuck with this amazing deal, which he managed to get everyone breathe a sigh of relief, which of course was terrible for Greece. The second bailout was appalling. Greece would have defaulted right then. And I think that was the worst mistake that Greece made to do that. So I could not agree with you more. I don't know whether you, on that first question, you have something else, and we can take the answer.
Yeah, I agree with that.
You agree with that?
Except just to say, well, I was at Cannes in December 2010 when the meeting took place, and Sarkozy grabbed Papandreou by the lapels, according to one of the Conservative advisors who was there. And why would have Papandreou gone with it? You know, in the sense, because it goes back to what I'm talking about. He thought he was dealing with Sarkozy. Sarkozy had a lot of leverage over Merkel in a way that Hollande doesn't.
He thought he'd be supported.
Yeah, and we also remember we were dealing then, I think we were actually shouted a question at him, we were also dealing with Berlusconi. So you had the old Europeanist guard, and when they made a pledge, clearly what they pledged were, save our banks, and look, you know, impose austerity, it'll all be all right. But what's happened is that, first of all, Papandreou realised, I'm going on a bit now, but he realised in the summer of 2011 that it wasn't going to work, and he tried to hold the referendum, got torpedoed. Venizelos comes in. We're talking now, by the time we get, you think Lafazanis and the left wing of PASOK, of Syriza can be accused of, brutalism at an economic level. But Venizelos, did not have a bunch of advisors with him who, in my opinion, knew what they were talking about. And then he's running the finance ministry. Hooray for him! He crashes the economy some more. So this is the problem. But so they're not dealing with the Europe they thought they were dealing with.
And they're not doing it right either.
Yeah, let's answer some of the more questions. What else?
No. There was the one on the IMF. Where we.
But is the current? Are we on a slippery slope to default?
You're
well, that's
asking
what she asked. I think.
It was a
Well,
question
did you ask
relating
that?
to the new cash reserve.
Yeah,
in
so
Greece.
what
Oh,
happened
yes.
yesterday?
Well, I mean, the interesting thing, I interpret that quite differently. I interpret it as suggesting that they actually want to keep going and pay the amount that they owed. Certainly, I mean, the thing is that there are the small bits, well, the relatively small bits that are owed to the ECB and the IMF, which have only about 8% each, I think, of the overall debt. Now those are in a way sacrosanct, in a way, even though you can have all sorts of discussions and maybe delay a bit. The IMF has said if you delay payment, it means that it's additional funding, so we don't really want to do that. But if those are out of the way, and there are, I think in total about...
There's 11 billion.
Yeah.
There's 11 billion of T-bills and the rest, the 15 billion, so it's about 4.5 billion is IMF ECB.
Yes, so it's not huge. That needs to be repaid over the next,
6 months.
6 months. This is it. I'm very glad we're together on it. So we can finish each other's sentences. 6 months. Now, obviously, if the Greeks can get the 7.5 billion that's due to them for the second bailout, which is still there, that can cover it. Everything to do with the rest of the certainly the 240 billion which they owe overall as a result of the two bailouts plus the extra 90 that's out there. Is long term and can easily, in a number of cases, you don't actually start paying any interest for another decade, and you can push a lot of it further back. And I think there's almost agreement that this can happen. So you can have 30 years moratorium basically, where you pay nothing, and the interest rates really only start being paid at a certain time as well. Still stays in the books of the Europeans, and that still counts as if Germany hasn't really lost anything. That's the thing that makes sense. So I think they're trying to keep their determination is to do the ECB, which is quite small repayments actually. I think for the next couple of months only about 300 million, and the IMF ones, and then see whether they can renegotiate with the others. Get to the point where they can actually get themselves into a position where they are financially able to do some of the restructuring. But there is another point, which is that if Paul is right that there is indeed underneath all this noise that we hear some movement towards some agreement, but there is a very important part of this. So which is that if the review concludes satisfactorily at present, I mean, the Greeks, even though they've been downgraded again, junk bond status is their in terms of the sovereign debt. They can't be part of the quantitative easing program. But there are exceptions if you're in a program, in a bailout program, which would qualify them. But then there are exceptions if you're under review, which again doesn't qualify them. So the sooner they get the review done, and if you're right, that would be brilliant, and it's accepted, then the sooner they can be part of the QE system, which means that rates fall very significantly. It means that once again you can actually tap the markets if you want to. So everything they have done so far suggests to me that they don't want to default. So the fact that they're raiding everything they can, in addition of course to needing to pay the pensions and workers, it's not just the municipalities, it's also the security funds, the social security funds and pension funds. The more it seems to me they want to stay in.
I think what it's doing though is it's removing the resilience of the public sector beyond the state. So if anything went wrong, like see, if there's a bank robbery, on pension payment day, suddenly you get problems. So, but I agree on that. I think that the slope towards default is a slope and it's not an edge. That's what the first thing we need to understand. If it does happen, I could be wrong. So there's one argument that a lot of Wall Street analysts who are pro-Greek would say is that they should have done capital controls early, so as to prevent the escape of capital from bank accounts and from the country. So that the elements of a soft default are selective default on certain things. I think I think it's more likely actually that they will default on the ECB payment, just as a political thing in July. All the others are to the IMF. The ECB thing hurts the ECB a lot more than it hurts Greece. So you go selective default, or we can't pay today but we'll pay in 30 days' time to the IMF. You do capital controls, which don't have to be, I was there in Cyprus during the Cypriot ones, the world didn't fall apart, the restaurants were still full, it wasn't a disaster. Then you do script, you do digital scripts, you do an alternative, you economics historians and economic policy people, this is a textbook being played out in front of your eyes. If Varoufakis does it, he knows exactly what he's going to do. It'll be a form of script between businesses, so businesses are already paying each other in bills of exchange, in promissory notes, because there's no money, there's no liquidity. You just formalise that between the public sector and its major suppliers. So one of the reasons they haven't done capital controls is this issue, I won't call it a problem, but an issue of the left platform within Syriza. Now, I think the left platform within Syriza isn't just people who support the Communist Party, because if the Communist Party is big enough that they could have been in it, it is people who think in a combination of traditional Moscow-orientated socialism and communism type way, the far left, and people who combine far leftism with an economic conviction that the good euro is not possible. So Lapavitsas, who's a professor here, I think falls into that category. He is not a KKE type person in that respect. He just profoundly believes, and he may be proved right, that there's no good euro. And it's more logical to begin from the position that you're going to end up with an exit and then start from there. Now, the fact that that hard left platform exists shouldn't blind you to the fact that within the Syriza centre, which is called something else, the left something, there are people to the left of that, but they're just pro-euro. So the thing is, anecdotally, the 30% plus Lafatzanis, Kostas Lapavitsas type group within Syriza is feeling very confident. They're feeling that they've been proved right and the centre has been proved wrong and made to look slightly idiotic. And this is, in my experience, tying the hands of the centrist leader, not centrist in your sense, but the sort of political centre of Syriza. Because they can't even have a discussion about, maybe we should do capital controls earlier, because then it's but that means the left were correct.
And that's why I don't think there will be capital controls. I think capital controls will be the end of the.
Yeah, exactly. So in a normal sequence, it comes at the end. Well, it comes on the day it all happens. Everything happens at once in a catastrophe. So that's where. On the multiplier effect, we should answer this because it's a good thing. All right, leave aside was it right or wrong. It has a massive practical bearing now, because right now Varoufakis Sakalatos, who's the economics minister and the foreign ministry, they're there by proxy or in person in Brussels, arguing, right, okay, you disagree with us about whether or not what our measures are going to be. We want as much of our programme moved into the IMF metrics, it's new Olivier Blanchard post discovering that he was completely wrong metrics, rather than the ECB one. But the ECB one is run by who? It's run by Weidmann, it's run by Schäuble. It's actually really important. But the only addition I would make to it is that you cannot underestimate with the multipliers. These were things that were, you know, it's a product of this utter abstract thinking in economics that cannot see, you know, that when you're talking about places like Spain, Italy and Greece, you're not talking about multipliers of anything. We're talking about, this is 3D chess. This is a place where even like 3 months ago, on the first days of Syriza, that a minister can, a top civil servant can mistakenly give back 1.2 billion euros to the EU. We weren't supposed to give back. Crazy things happen in these countries. That, I mean, 1.2 billion would knock your multipliers out of course. It would.
Well, this is the difference of the, as I was saying before, with the budget of 2015. I mean, it's a small country, and those amounts, but they are so small that you find it extraordinary why they're not actually being dealt with. But I think there is an issue about the IMF. Whoever asked the question, which is that not everyone within the IMF has been prepared to accept that this was a mistake. So there are loads of papers coming out all the time trying to prove that actually we were right. And if we were wrong, we were only a little bit. And maybe we underestimated the way in which the country works. It wasn't that our methods were wrong. It is that we underestimated some of the structural problems that Greece already had. But otherwise, it would have been great.
Alright, so let's see if we can fit just a few more questions in. I saw a hand up before. You want to pose your question?
Yeah, I just want to ask if you could elaborate maybe a bit on what you think might be the future role of like a bit more heterodox ways of Greek Syriza to gain financial assets such as privatization and other measures by assets being sold to China, like recently there was support sold to China, and the Chinese have shown some interest. So yeah, if that might help Syriza to achieve its political objectives.
So I was wondering if it's possible to have Greek default without Brexit.
Alright, is it a short question?
Yeah.
It's a very short question.
Sure.
Go ahead.
There seems to be like a concentration on statistics and percentages, but what do Syriza's policies actually mean for the lives of the Greeks? So you talk about cutting taxes and raising taxes and cutting pensions, and you talked about villages having electricity. What does that actually mean for people and living their lives?
I'm sure you have some knowledge of that.
Well,
but I'll have to ask you to be brief.
Okay,
yes,
yeah, cool.
okay, sorry about that. But Paul, of course, has gone and done this documentary. But I mean, I can tell you from my own experience that and from the, I'm afraid statistics are important because almost 4 million people are on the brink of poverty in Greece. In fact, a number of them are poor. So there's been this huge humanitarian crisis that has been developed. I explained before, you know, you can't do reforms if there is no welfare system there, and there hasn't been. And the government had to cut everything. So it's been really, really bad. So there are food banks for the Greeks, and you know, my sister gets involved in them where she lives. And frankly, when my family doesn't know where the next thing would come from. People do commit suicide. Jump from balconies seems to be the most favourite thing that people do, since they mostly live in apartments. But nevertheless, you still haven't got quite the rate of sort of panic that you see somewhere else. You know, when I remember ringing my sister who was on the beach sometime in October because the weather was still very nice, and said, well, you received yet another, you know, I've been hearing because I've been commenting about another tax increase. That was before the election. So how are you guys going to cope? And she said, look, I'm on the beach. It's so beautiful. That's how we cope. Which is absolutely true. So there is an element, but it has been very hard. I mean, there are families that, having lost their jobs, I mean, if you have 57% youth unemployment, of course, the interesting thing is that people are exiting. So suddenly you find Greeks who serve in bars, which was never, ever the case. with very good degrees. I mean, the Greeks tended to come here, study in good universities, and then go back to their mother's cooking. And that was now it doesn't happen anything like as much as was the case before. So it's been devastating. And then you depend on your grandmother's pension. That's been cut by sometimes for some of them 60%, which is extraordinary if that were to happen. Plus all the wages which have been cut significantly. Minimum wage is ridiculously low, and of course 27% unemployment. That doesn't help hugely.
Right. So we got 2 more questions. The possibility of a Greek default without a Grexit.
I think you can have a Greek default without a Grexit, and not only that, there's no legal way that a country can either be thrown out or leave the euro. That's the problem. So even if the Greeks were to default on their ECB loan, if their banks were to go bust, if they were going to send a strippogram to Schäuble, in front of the German Parliament, nothing they do can actually force them to actually leave the euro. But in other words, they have to be. This is a big problem for Europe when it happens. So I would, if there is a default, I would expect it to be default, partial default, referendum. Quite mealy-mouthed question in the referendum as well, not shall we leave the euro. That's one thing. This question about what's it mean, and also the heterodox thing. Those of you who know the work of Castells, who's studied the impact of crisis in Catalonia, will know there's quite a decent book called Aftermath, where they look at the rise of unusual and unorthodox economic responses by people to the crisis. What you see is the rise of a sort of quite hippie-ish, peer-to-peer style economy in Catalonia, but done, and also Andalusia, done by very poor people. What is a lifestyle choice for hipsters becomes a necessity, like squatting places, like food banks, like seed banks, like time banks, like alternative currencies. These are all there. Now, the Greek situation, apparently, especially in northern Greece and rural Greece, this is already there. And it's apparently a feature of a lot of southern European societies that's been very badly documented, the crisis responses. But the interesting thing from Syriza's point of view is that the Deputy Prime Minister, Dragousakis, has a whole department and team of advisors who are obsessed with P2P economics and would have, in normal circumstances, tried to actually foster, and indeed are, tried to foster this as a non-negligible part of crisis response. So alternative currencies, alt-seed banks, etc. Final thing on the what does it mean for people? I would draw you back again and again to this issue. What does the policy mean, and how do people survive? I think the resilience of Greek society has been largely due to family life, people's ability to sustain through family life. It's reached, I think, after 4 years, it reached its end. Its ability to sustain the political situation. People were giving up. So far, most of the anti-poverty measures that Syriza has enacted have barely begun to actually happen. So the reconnection of electricity, or the handout to the, 6,000, 7,000, it's not a lot of families, very poor families. These are barely happening. I think if they fell as a government tomorrow and people said economically, what did you do for people? I think they'd find it very difficult to put their hand on their heart and say, there's the results. They could say, there's the measures, the electricity and the humanitarian relief. But in terms of, that the cleaning women got their jobs back, no, not yet. So there's a lot that hasn't been done.
Just add a couple of things. I mean, first of all, there's been an awful lot of bartering going on. So people are doing lessons for food and so on. So there's quite a lot of that. In particular villages as well, here particularly in northern Greece, which I think is actually absolutely great. But it is quite interesting that despite everything, there hasn't been this panic about Grexit, which was asked, that there was back in 2012. And the money hasn't moved out of Greece anything like as fast as you would expect. So there may have been 20 to 30 billion that's gone. A little bit came back for a bit, but hugely less than was the case before. And the interesting thing is that there's still at the last reckoning, just around 150 billion of deposits in the Greek banking system. So someone's got some money somewhere. That of course includes companies. And some of those deposits, of course, were some of the public corporations and some of the municipalities and all that sort of stuff. So it may well be getting depleted quite considerably. But it's still there. There is some belief that there will be a good result in the end. And the Greeks have not been anything like as panicky about this as you would expect. It may just be that they've just given up. That there is a limit to how much they want to queue outside or whatever it is that they want to do. We see on the occasional day when there is a bit of queuing going on. But they have become almost, they're just waiting from day to day. And you asked again about the family. I can tell you from the people that I know, they don't sleep well, they have all sorts of ailments they never had before, which is extraordinary to watch. So I have offered my house for whoever wants to come and live here and you sort of basically come and survive. And I haven't had any takers yet, but nevertheless, it is. Lots of people are having this. I mean, actually, I have my niece who's here in the UK. I have, as I said, a huge influx of individuals who are coming over to work here, and that destroys actually a lot of the family life that has supported Greece for so long. So I think at some point it will erupt. So going back to what might cause us to leave the euro, I think if we leave Europe, if we leave the EU, and so if we become a country which is, suddenly we have a lot of unrest because they can take it only so far, and if this had happened any other country in Europe, the politicians would have been lynched without any doubt. The fact that they've survived for so long is extraordinary, but it could all come to breaking point, and of course you can have the military in again, and if you have a lot of democracy, whichever way it happens, then that is, you can't be a member of the EU. That's the only way you can do it. But so far, I think...
As long as you're not Hungary,
you can have
lots of democracy for a long time.
That is true. But I mean, the interesting thing though is about this particular government, so that it cannot be called, to be communist itself. The alliance and to keep I presume the army at bay. The alliance with the right wingers, the independent Greeks. It's been a very clever move so far, because also their head has been put in charge of defence, where the army, etc., reports to. So maybe the danger isn't that great. But I think that has always been my worry, that the society will erupt at some point, and we won't be able to control it.
Let's hope that doesn't happen, and let's give a round of applause.
Anybody who wants to ask more questions, my Twitter handle is @PaulMasonNews, and so that's the easiest way to, rather than try and rugby tackle me as a leader.
We'll have to end this now. I'm sorry we haven't got the room any longer. So I just want to remind you, end of June we've got the Rethinking Economics conference coming up. Greekonomics for sale outside of this room. And Open Economics Forum, always looking for more volunteers to set up events like these.
Please.